Lillian Gantsutis, and we are doing the Veterans History Project. Interviewing today is March the 31st, 2004. We're at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. With us today is Thomas Marion Johnson, Jr. Mr. Johnson, would you repeat your name and give me your birthday?
Thomas Marion Johnson, Jr., July the 15th, 1925.
All right, and tell me something about where you were born and raised.
I was born in Savannah, Georgia, and was raised there until I was 12 years old when I was sent off to school. But I spent time in both Savannah and Augusta. My grandparents were in Augusta, and I was the oldest of 5 children. And every time my mother had another child, I got sent up to Augusta for a month or so, so that she could have some breathing room. When I was very young, my mother and father purchased a home out on a river on the outskirts of Savannah, actually outside of the city. And we grew up on that river, which was a delightful place to have your boyhood.
You said you went off to school. Where did you go?
I went off to school when I was 12 to Episcopal High School up in Virginia, and was there for 4 years. And then I went to college at the Virginia Military Institute. I was there a year before I went into the Army during World War II.
Tell me something about just an experience maybe at Episcopal High School that you remember.
Well, of course, it was my first experience with things like snow. And it was a small school, still is a relatively small school, but has quite a wonderful background to it and quite a history. My father sent me there because when he went to college, the folks that did best in college when he was there had been graduates of Episcopal, and he thought they'd gotten the best preparatory education. And I must say, we got a fine education there. I had no problem at all when I got to college.
You said you were the oldest of 5.
Yes.
Your siblings, did you have other brothers that went to Episcopal, or did they all go on?
No, I had two brothers that went to Episcopal, both of them. And they, of course, were after me.
Mm-hmm. What's your current occupation? Are you
I'm retired.
retired? What did you do for
I was a lawyer.
At the time of the war, you were at when the were you drafted or did you enlist? You were at Virginia Military Academy.
Well, I was at VMI, but the war started when I was still at Episcopal. And in anticipation of the war, my mother's family, all of them had quite a distinguished military background. My great-great-grandfather was a general in the Confederate Army. My great-grandfather was a drummer boy at the age of 16 during the unfortunate war between the states. He later became the commandant of the Confederate veterans, and was quite a character. My grandfather had been to VMI, and he was a colonel when the First World War broke out, but he was in the process of building roads and bridges in Virginia, and they wouldn't take him into the Army. They said his work at home was more important than going overseas. So he did not see action, and he was very disappointed in it. It was the first time that his country had been involved in a war from the time of the beginning that a member of his family was not actively involved and under fire. I have an uncle who, or had an uncle, he's now passed on, who went into the Army about the same time I did. But he had quite a background with the National Guard, and they put him in training units rather than in combat units. And he was very unhappy about that because he was going to miss out on the war. Somehow or another, he volunteered and got sent overseas and was involved in actual combat for a brief period. I was over there at the same time, and because I didn't have the same last name, I didn't count. But anyhow, we ended up with quite a record of it.
When did you graduate from Episcopal?
Episcopal at the time I was there was, by the time you graduated, you'd finished about half of your college education. So I didn't graduate. I went to college and I was accepted wherever I applied. And you had to have something like 19 credits to get into college at that point. And I had 22, so there wasn't any point in going to school for another year passing the time.
Well, then what year did you start VMI?
In 1942. And at VMI, I might digress for just a second, they realized that all of us were going to be involved in the war. So there was a conscious effort to train us for service in the armed forces. And I was in artillery, and they gave us full artillery training, everything from a private to a battalion commander. That we performed those tasks during the year that I was there, which came in handy at one point or another during the war. And when we were getting ready to cross the Rhine, I was a forward observer with 81 mortars in the infantry, and I got pinned down while I was trying to zero my mortars in by artillery from the German side. And so I called back and said, I need some help. And they asked me if I could zero the artillery in for them, which I did. And we zeroed the artillery in on this fortress across the river. And it was fantastic. I didn't realize they had so much artillery behind us. They had 40 batteries of it. And the whole thing opened up on this poor fort over there. And they blew it up. I went by the fort a couple of years ago, and it's still not in very good shape. But it was kind of a blessing in disguise, because the next day when we crossed the river, we didn't have a shot fired at us. We went straight across and took off like scared rabbits.
And VMI had trained you for all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you're at VMI. Do you enlist or are you drafted?
Well, when I came home to enlist, and they said, well, you'll get in quicker if you just let us go ahead and draft you. Mm-hmm. I went down to the Selected Service Board.
Is this in Savannah?
Yeah. And the arrangement was supposed to be, I'd been on the water all my life, and they had these Air Rescue Squadrons in Savannah. And so they wanted to put me in one of those because I was already trained to do that. And so I went down to enlist and get in that, and they told me I'd get in quicker if I got drafted, so they drafted me, and I got my notice the next day and was gone. I got up to Fort McPherson and expecting to be sent back to Savannah, and they told me that I wasn't going back to Savannah just yet. I had to go to Fort Benning first. And it turned out that I had taken a test at VMI. The Army and the armed services were giving tests to people in various parts of the country, trying to figure out what were the best indication of what could happen to you. And they gave them to us at VMI as well as the folks at West Point and Annapolis, and they kept records of it. And I had scored right high on the test, and they told me that I couldn't go into the Air Force. I had to go into a special training program. So I was put in this special training program.
Is that good news to you or bad news?
Well, it didn't sound so bad at the time because they were going to send us back to college, which that sounded pretty good. But anyhow, I had my assignment. I was going back to VMI, as a matter of fact. And about 3 or 4 days before I was supposed to leave, I was told that we were told that all the orders had been canceled and we had new orders. And it turned out that we had received infantry training down at Fort Benning for 4 months prior to being supposedly sent back to college. And the war in Europe was heating up at that point, and they needed a bunch of cannon fodder over there. So there must have been 15 or 20,000 of us who were freshly trained infantrymen down at Benning. And they said, well, heck, we'd just take them and send them over as replacements. So that's what they did. And I was sent as a replacement in an infantry division that was being formed.
When was this? Do you remember?
It was in the early 44.
Early 44.
Okay. And we were sent to Jackson, and we then were sent on over to Europe in, I think it was about September of 44.
Now, you say we. Were there any guys that you made friends with or that you kept up with, or tell me something about the people that you were with?
Well, when we got to Fort Jackson, when we were down at Benning, you didn't really have a chance to develop friendships. When we got to Jackson, the first weekend came along and they told us we could have a weekend pass. And Fort Jackson is in Columbia, and that's only 150 miles from Savannah. And in the barracks, I said, I got up and said, asked if anyone would like to go home with me for the weekend. And there were 3 guys who allowed us how they would, so the 4 of us took off and went down to Savannah for the weekend. Two of them fell out after a short while, but the other one, a fellow named Warren Sweeney from Cleveland, he and I have been lifelong friends. As a matter of fact, I talked with him last week on the phone for a while. But he and I enjoyed things together. And
did you all stay together the whole time?
Well, we were in the same company, but we were both of us forward observers. And as forward observers, you were assigned rifle companies. And he was assigned one, and I was assigned another one.
Spell Sweeney for me. Walter Sweeney.
No,
spell his
Warren.
Warren. Spell his last name.
Sweeny.
Okay.
Delightful Irish fellow from Cleveland. He had also been to a year of college before going in the service. He'd been to Yale, and he returned to Yale after the war. I didn't return to VMI. When I came back, I'd had enough military. So I went to Vanderbilt.
Let's talk about from Columbia. Where do you go next? Are you on the boat overseas, or?
We left from Columbia, and they put us on a train and took us up to Fort Dix and put us on a boat.
Crowded train, crowded boat?
I mean, we went over on Queen Elizabeth. It never had been commissioned into the Canard lines, and it was finished off as a troop ship. And there were 18,000 of us birds on there. And it was a mess. But anyhow, we crossed the ocean in a big hurry. And we landed in Glasgow and went to some sort of little camp in England over near Manchester. And were there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we went on over to the continent, landed in Le Havre, and they put us on trucks, and we went down to Metz and went into action down in Metz.
What were you doing during this time? I mean, were they giving you any training, or were you just traveling? What was your specialty?
Well,
what happened from the time you landed in Glasgow until you end up in Metz?
we weren't there very long.
Just long enough to travel?
It was only a couple of weeks, and we stayed in very crude barracks. They had a pot-bellied stove to keep them warm, and it was cold over there. I mean, it was snowing outside. And we then went across to Le Havre and unloaded there, and they unloaded us into a field, and we pitched tents. But the field was icy and muddy. It was yuck. And we went there long, but went on down to Metz, and there was a large, famous fort down there that had been pretty well taken, but we went down and finished taking the fort and had a few shots fired back and forth, but not anything serious. And from there we went up to the Saar Basin and were involved in the attack in that area for about a week.
Well, tell me about that attack. What was going on? What were you doing? Were there casualties around you?
Oh, yeah. And we were there for just a few days, and the Battle of the Bulge broke out. And our division was in Patton's Third Army. And this was approaching Christmas, because I remember we were pulled out of the line on Christmas Eve, and we went into some town. I don't even know the name of the town. And spent one night there, and the next morning we loaded in trucks, heading on up into the Battle of the Bulge. And we were part of the army that relieved the southern flank of the battle there.
Where did you stay that night? I mean, it's Christmas Eve. Was there? Were you in a tent? Were you in?
No, we didn't.
Just
in the tents, we didn't. Excuse me. We didn't stay in tents very often. And, there were some beat-up buildings there, and we found one that wasn't leaking, and about 10 of us in a room, and spent the night there.
Were there letters from home? Was there anything that made it feel like Christmas, or just a...
The only thing that made it feel like Christmas was the lieutenant of the rifle company that I was assigned to at that point came in and said that it was, of course, Christmas Eve, and in celebration they'd issued the officers a bottle of whiskey, but he was going to share it with us. And so we were given each a little sip of whiskey, and the bottle was gone.
10 guys and each with a sip. I bet it didn't take
Well, there
long.
weren't that many. There were only about 6 or 7 of us in there, because, see, the forward observers were assigned to a rifle company, and you accompanied the company commander wherever he went, so that we had to carry a radio And it wasn't one of these little cell phones. They're a 50-pound monster that you had to tote around on your back.
What else were you toting?
You had a weapon of some sort. Most of the time I carried a .45 automatic. Part of the time I carried a rifle, and part of the time I carried what they used to call them. But anyhow, it was a small rifle.
So you've got a rifle, you've got 45, some ammunition,
Yeah.
radio.
Yeah. The radio was a monster. I mean, it was, I think it's 40 or 50 pounds worth.
Do you have a change of clothes? In Forrest Gump, they talk about keeping your feet dry and having an extra pair of socks.
It was impossible to change clothes and so forth. As a matter of fact, we, from the time we went into action until the time we got across the Moselle River, we were unable to bathe. It was almost 6 weeks. And I have since then never enjoyed anything so much as taking a bath every day.
So if you're not taking a bath, are you not shaving and brushing your teeth for 6 weeks? I mean, I know these are personal questions.
No, actually, we were in General Patton's army, and he required you to be clean looking at all times. Here we were smelling to high heaven, I know, and yet when we took a town, we had to put on ties and dress up like we were going on a dress parade. And made us stay shaved at all times except for a mustache. And you, of course, brushed your teeth if you could. They had water. You carried a canteen that had some water in it. And you had these 5-gallon cans that you carried on the jeeps that accompanied you. And you could get water out of those most of the time. To what we'd do, we'd fill our helmets with them and heat the helmet up and use that to shave with. I must say, you didn't get very clean that way.
No.
But it was not a happy sort of a thing. But I remember when we finally got to, I think it was the Moselle River, and there was a camp set up there with these tents that had showers in them, and it was cold as a dickens. You could see the steam coming out of the tents from the warm water, and you'd go in there, and we went in and took a shower, and it felt wonderful. But then you had to get out of the shower and get in that cold weather again. It was dreadful.
Early polar bear clubs, isn't it?
Mm.
With the amount of action that you saw, I mean, if you were a forward line, tell me sort of a typical procedure. What your procedures would be as you moved forward.
It seemed somewhat chaotic to most of us, but you were in constant contact with the enemy. We ended up, once we went into actual combat with and moving forward, we stayed on the move for the better part of 6 months and didn't go back the whole time. The only ones that went back were folks who got wounded or something like that. I know my feet got frozen, and they turned black, and I went back to the aid station to see what they could do about them. And they gave me a pair of galoshes and said, put some straw in them and wear these until your feet go down. And it was hard getting around. But we moved on, and General Patton, bless his soul, we cussed him every step of the way, but he kept us moving against the Germans, and that's what beat them. And it was hard. Mm-hmm. And as an indication, for instance, the rifle company that I was with, and the rifle company had roughly 180 people in it, 180 men. And when the war ended, there were 6 out of that 180 that were still there. The rest of them had either been killed or wounded or whatever. And fortunately, I was one of those 6. But it was really a living nightmare for the whole time. And to see people just go to pieces, well, it was dreadful.
When you're not sort of pushing forward, there may not have been a time when you were not pushing forward, but were there any leisure activities? Any way to relieve the stress?
We didn't. The only time you could relieve the stress was when it got dark and you couldn't see where to go anymore. And you'd frequently sit down and go to sleep sitting.
So it was pretty much either, for 6 months, either sleep or push forward?
Mm-hmm. And it was just so darn constant. But anyhow, to those of us who survived, we were very happy when the war ended. The war ended when we were getting ready to, well, we had gotten all the way across Germany. And we had to stop because the Russians hadn't gotten up to where we were, and the Russians were supposed to take what was in front of us. So we had to stop and let the Russians come take it. And then the Russians finally got there, and we...
When you say there, where are you talking about?
We were on the Czechoslovakian border.
Okay.
And actually down a little south of Leipzig in a town called Plauen. And Plauen was a dreadful place when we got there. It was a city that was, at that point, I equated it in size to Savannah, for instance. It had about 120,000 people. And our Air Force was bombing the oil fields down in Romania. And when they couldn't get there, they would turn around and head back and drop the bombs wherever they could get rid of them. And they were dropping them wherever they found a city that wasn't all bombed out already. And Plauen happened to be one, and they unloaded on it on Easter Sunday in 1945. And we got there, and you can't imagine a place like that. It was, we were told that 18,000 civilians had been killed. And they had them stacked along the roads, 4 and 5 deep, corpse of people. And we were used to men seeing corpses of men, but the women and children it broke you out. And also the smell was just unreal. You could smell it 5 miles away. And we stood plowing, and what we did was they wouldn't let us stay in the town. We had to stay outside of the town. And by that time, though, the Germans had departed, and we were using the Germans to help clean up things and to bury the bodies and this, that, and the other. And there was a sizable Russian labor camp there. There were several thousand Russian forced labor. And we quickly established with them that we were in charge and not them. which it took a while for them to understand. But heck, I sympathize so with this Iraq situation, because here we had one company that was patrolling virtually the whole city, and we had 3 jeeps, and we were supposed to be keeping law and order. And one morning we went out and on regular patrol just to make sure everything's quiet. And here came a crowd of Russians walking up the street. And we told them to stop, and they said no, they wanted to go up to the warehouse up there and get some fresh clothes and things. They knew the warehouse was full, and they were going to go help themselves. And we said, no, you're not. And so I don't know whether the Army did it by design or whether it was just fortunate or what, but in our company we had a guy who spoke Czechoslovakian, a guy who spoke fluent German. I spoke some German at that point, and I spoke some French, and we had a fellow from Louisiana who could speak French better than he could speak English. And we had 2 guys who spoke Russian. And so we could talk with anywhere we went, and had been able to do so all the way across Europe, which was, I thought, right interesting. But anyhow, if the Army did it on purpose, I don't think they're that smart, but it happened anyhow. But when these folks kept advancing on us, we had a machine gun on the Jeep, and a driver and me. There were just 3 of us. And the machine gunner said, "What do we do?" And I said, "Lower the gun." And he said, "You mean we could shoot them?" And I said, "Yep, if they don't stop." And so he lowered the gun, and we spoke to him and told him to stop, that we were going to fire, because our orders were that they weren't supposed to go any further. And with that, they just busted out laughing and came on. So we fired. And about a half a dozen of them were hit. They quickly stopped, and they picked up the casualties and went back to where they were supposed to be, and they never came back out. We then visited there regularly to try and establish a relationship with them, because they, what they had done in some of the other towns in Germany, when they had been freed, they immediately went and tried to find the mayor of the town and so forth, and hung them up from lampposts and things of that nature. So we were trying to keep that from happening, and we did. And ended up we were best of friends. I don't know where they got it from, but they'd got some white lightning in the camp, and they'd have a party about every night. But it was interesting. And then, fortunately, the war, we were then supposed to jump off to go into Czechoslovakia, and that day the war ended.
How did that feel? How did you hear that the war ended?
We got word from the rear that the war was over, and so we were supposed to hold up instead of jumping off. And
was it in print or a radio or just
radio? Well, they had loudspeakers on some of the tanks, and they had loudspeakers on the tanks saying the war was over. And the Germans didn't believe it at first, and then their radios told them that the war was over. And so they all came out, and the war was over. It was great. A wonderful sort of an occasion.
So what happened? The war's over, and...
Well, when the war ended, it was...
Are you still in Czechoslovakia?
We were in Czechoslovakia, and we stayed there for about a week. And then our division was being reassigned to the Pacific to invade Japan. And what they did, they tried to select the divisions that were the least beat up at that point to send them back. And we were one of the least beat up, apparently. I don't know how in the world the others, what happened to the others.
You were one of 6. I'd say you were pretty beat up.
Yep. And
But
it
if
was,
you're not beat up, that's, you know.
well, we had gotten new
I understand.
replacements and so forth, so it was, we were at full strength. And so they put us on a train and sent us back to Le Havre, which was quite a trek. But one of the things that happened while we were still over there at this, on the Czech border was they had a rotation system where you were sent back to the States for 90 days after you'd been over there in combat for so long. And I qualified for it, so I was to be reassigned and get leave back to the States. And then war ended, and they said, no, we cancel that. And so,
You were just like one day off of everything, weren't you?
and so we, well, I was one day off on something else, which was the invasion in Normandy. I missed that by 3 days because I was still only 18, and the powers that be decided they didn't want to send any 18-year-olds in on the beach. It had to be 19. But anyhow, we got on this train and they started us back, and we went part way and had to get off. And then I found that that I was qualified for a pass to Paris, which sounded pretty darn good. And we'd gotten back into France by then. And you had to, in order to go on one of these passes, you had to have some money. And my father, bless his soul, had given me some traveler's checks to take with me. And so I had $100 in traveler's checks, and you had to have $30 in order to go. And so I got my 2 buddies, Sweeney and one other guy, and the 3 of us went into Paris and had a ball for 3 days.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear you finally got some time off.
Yeah.
So what did you do in Paris?
We did everything.
Ate, drank, sleep?
Yep. Went to the Folies Bergère and everything else. And then we went from there on to Le Havre, where we were loaded onto what was then the West Point, which is now which became the America, which was the United States bid for cross-Atlantic passenger. And it was unbelievable. That was likewise another really big ship, but there were some 12,000 of us on there. And we headed out of the harbor, and the channel had 40-foot waves in it. And the captain of the ship came on the system and said that this was his final voyage before his retirement, and this ship he felt was the fastest ship in the world, and he was going to prove it, going across the Atlantic and break the record. And he headed out of the channel there, and that boat was like a speedboat, throwing the waves all the way back over its stern and so forth. And it was really rocking. It was great.
Seasick?
I was going to get to that. I had gotten reacquainted with an old friend from Episcopal High, as a matter of fact, who had been in the division the whole time, and neither one of us knew the other one was there.
What's his name?
Lewis Kirby. And we decided that we'd go up and watch us go out of the harbor and in the channel, and we got out there, and it was really so rough that you kind of had to hang on. But then when we went back inside, it smelled so dreadfully. Everybody was sick. We finally went down to get some supper, and there were about 15 of us for supper. Out of
12,000?
Yep. we went in there, and it was pitiful. You asked what we did for food and everything. Going across Europe, we had mostly K-rations, which were Cracker Jack box with a couple of little tidbits in it. I lost about 50 pounds going across Europe, and I was down to around 120 pounds. And when my last, I wrestled at VMI in my last match, I couldn't make my weight because I couldn't get down under 155. And so that's a lot of weight to lose. But we went down to get something to eat, and we walked up to the counter, and the cooks were just tickled to death to, we were the first ones to get on their ship who'd been in combat and so forth, so they were really eager to make us happy. And they asked what we wanted, and we said, nice big fat steak and so forth. So they gave us these big old steaks. We had about 2 bites, and we couldn't eat anymore. We were full. It was pitiful. But anyhow, Louis and I had a delightful time. We ended up staying up underneath the bridge. There was a kind of overhang there, and we spent the night up there watching us go out of the channel, and it was fantastic. And he did end up breaking the record for transatlantic crossing.
How long did it take?
3.5 days.
Wow, got you back quick.
Well, we got back to New York, and they didn't have a berth for us because we were a day too early. And so we had to stand off in New York Harbor for a day. And then we came on in, and it was really a beautiful.
What was it like when you would come in? Were there people, did your family know that you were arriving? Were there people there? No?
But they had the fire boats that did the skeet in the water and so forth. And they had them surrounding us, making a big deal out of it. And they were tooting their horns and all this stuff. And New Yorkers know how to put on a celebration. And they were doing it.
Yeah. So you'd been gone a year.
We were gone not quite a year. We were gone about 9 months. And we got back, and we were sent down to Fort Benning, somewhere different. And I got a 30-day pass to go home before coming back and going out to the Pacific. And the war ended during that 30 days.
So you were at home when the war ended?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how did you learn that?
Well, as a matter of fact,
Radio or?
No, a friend of mine and I were on my father's boat, and we were down out in the ocean fishing, and we started hearing the sirens going off, and we figured that was it. So we headed home, and when we got to the dock, there were about 10 people there holding drinks out for us and so forth, so we knew the war was over. Excuse me, it really does bring back very fond memories.
Oh, it's an emotional time.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you just out of the Army at that point? How does the Army let you go? Do you have to?
No, we then had to be reassigned. Mm-hmm. Well, they hadn't broken up the division yet. Mm-hmm. And we had to go back to Fort Benning. And at Benning, they reassigned me to Fort McPherson here in Atlanta. And I got...
What was your assignment here at Fort McPherson?
I was assigned to the the separation center.
Mm-hmm. What's your rank at this point? I don't know that we've even discussed your rank yet.
At that point, I was a corporal. I had been a sergeant at one point, but I didn't agree with the way the war was being run and informed my officers about it. They didn't like the way I informed them, so I suddenly became a private again. But got to Fort Mac, and there was a man at Fort Mac in the reception center. He happened to see me. He knew me. He worked for my father. And he immediately came over and said, "Tommy, I got a deal for you." I said, "What's that, Jimmy?" He said, "I'm going to let you have my job." And I said, "Jimmy, I don't want a job. I want to get out." And he said, "Well, you'd be in perfect position to get out quicker." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, I'm Personnel Sergeant Major of the Reception Center." And the Reception Center is what you bring new troops into, and said, "At this time, we ain't got nobody coming in here." And so there's nothing to do. So you won't be around long, and that'll give me a chance to get out and get home and get my life back together. I said, "Okay." So I became acting personnel sergeant major from Doughfoot in the infantry, and was there for, I think it was about almost 2 months. And during that period of time, though, all of a sudden they started signing up all of these regular Army people who had gotten temporary commissions and so forth, and realized that if they re-enlisted, they would be retired with the highest rank they held in service. And a bunch of these guys, I mean, captains, majors, colonels, and their real rank was like corporal or private or whatever. And so they, instead of all of them going home, they all re-enlisted, because they only had another year or two to go and they'd have a fat pension. And so instead of having nothing to do,
You did have something to do.
good glory, all of a sudden I ended up with 5,000 people that I had to look out for. And the colonel was an old Army fellow who was not the sharpest, and he was frantic. All of these guys had been reassigned. He happened to be old Army, and they were old Army, and they knew each other, and they were screaming to get paid and so forth so they could go on leave. And I said, "Well, Colonel, we can take care of it." And he said, "How's that?" I said, "Well, somebody's been paying them over in England or wherever they came from." I said, "Let's track down and find out who it was and get them transferred over to do it here." He said, "Oh, we can't do that." I said, "Well, give me an afternoon to work on it and I will." So I went to work on it and found out they had a whole complete unit, payroll unit over in England that wasn't doing anything because we had all the guys over here.
So if you had to bring those guys from England over, let them.
Well, we had them. They flew them back, and they were back in 2 days. And they were issuing the checks, and everybody was happy as it could be. And I went down and checked my records and found out that I had enough points to get out. So I wrote myself a separation notice, gave myself a discharge, and left. And the colonel, all he said was, "Just let me have your phone number in case we have a problem so I can get you back up." And he called me twice about something, and that was all the more I heard from him.
So you leave Fort McPherson, you head back to Savannah, you enroll in Vanderbilt.
Yep. Well, I got back there, thought I was going to have some time to goof off. And my father said, "No," he said, "it's time for you to get back to school now." And I said, "Well, I understand it's kind of difficult to do." And he said, "No, not at all." He said, "I've got you enrolled in 3 schools. You can take your pick." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you've been accepted at Harvard, at Wharton, and at Vanderbilt. Which one do you want?" And I said, "Well, I'll take Vanderbilt because that's closer." But I didn't check the railroad schedules first. It took 2 days to get to Vanderbilt from Savannah, whereas it only took overnight to Philadelphia and Boston. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, I went to Vanderbilt, and it was very happy.
Mm-hmm. When did you graduate from Vanderbilt?
I switched from academic school when you had been in the Army and also had been to school prior to going in the Army. They didn't require you to take required courses. You could take whatever you wanted to, so I took what I wanted to and had everything I wanted by the time I'd finished my junior year. And so I switched to law school for the last year and decided I liked law school, so I went on and finished in law school, but that was in Georgia. I switched over from Vanderbilt to Georgia because I had been out of the state for 25 years and decided about time to get home. But
So what year was this? When did you?
I got my, well, they gave me a degree in 1948 from Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt, and then you went to Georgia Law.
And I finished up at Georgia Law. I went 2 years at Vanderbilt and then 1 year at Georgia, and finished up at Georgia in '50.
Did you marry?
Yep,
How
after
did you meet your wife?
my wife went to school at Sweetbriar, and she and my sister, who also went to school at Sweetbriar, got to be good friends there. And it was a right cute sort of little story. My sister was, my mother and father had gone up to Lynchburg to take my sister out to dinner. And so they invited what became my wife to go out with them. And Catherine, my sister, told them that she had found the guy she was going to marry and hoped they would approve. And they discussed it during dinner and decided, yep, that was a good idea, and so forth and so on. And during the course of the conversation, said, well, we'll have to fix Benita up with somebody now. And so they went through the possibilities and ended up, I was about 6th or 7th on the list, but she knew less about me than the rest of them, so I was a target. And they really set me up beautifully for it. They invited her down for a weekend, and she came down, and they had her lined up with dates the whole time she was there, so I couldn't have a date with her. But it was funny. As soon as I met this wonderful gal, I knew this was it.
How long did y'all date?
I had 2 dates with her before I had to go speak to her father and ask for her hand.
You did know right off the bat, didn't you?
Sure did. And he thought that was absurd. And she, by that time, had switched to Chapel Hill, where she was in school. And he insisted that she finish college, and she was just as insistent that she wouldn't. But anyhow, they ended up with a compromise that she would at least go on back up there and stay until Christmas and see how things looked. And just before Christmas, he called and said, pack your things and come on home. So she came on home, and we got married the following spring.
What year was that?
1951.
Do you have children?
4.
What are their names? What are your wife's name? What was her maiden name?
Benita Fennessy.
And your children?
Children, Thomas III, Stuart Fennessy, William Allen, and Mary Louise.
Do you have grandchildren?
5 of them. 5 or 6. 5 of them.
That's wonderful. Congratulations. Before we finish, is there anything else that you, when you were going through all of this, when you were moving with Patton, did you have any idea how historic and heroic what Patton was doing? I mean, did you have any sense of that then? When did you sort of gain a sense of that?
Well, we got the Stars and Stripes, which was a good propaganda sheet for Patton. But we also had an uncle who sent me the microfilmed Philadelphia newspapers, which was a great help. And they usually got there within a week of the time of the publication.
Microfilm. So it would, how would you?
Well, instead of being the big thing on a piece of paper like that.
And how would you read it?
Well, it was printed out.
Oh, it was printed out. When
But
you say
just-
microfilm, I just imagined that you had something tiny and
No, they just reproduced it on something like that. But it was a big help, so we knew what was going on. And also my aunt was in the Red Cross, one of those donut coffee machines and so forth. And she spent practically the whole war with Patton's headquarters. And I kept trying to catch up with her. And our paths crossed, but we missed by a day or so everywhere. But we stayed in contact. I mean, we rode, so.
So you knew what
Yeah.
sort of how important all of this was.
Oh, yeah.
Is there anything in closing that you want to add about your military experience, or?
Well, as I mentioned to whoever it was I talked with on the telephone, before I went in the Army, they had something called the Coast Guard Auxiliary that was supposed to be watching out for saboteurs and so forth along the coast in the absence of regular Coast Guard people or Navy. I mean, we were real thin when the war broke out. And so what they did was they put anyone who had a boat that was serviceable could volunteer their boat and themselves to go into what they called Coast Guard Auxiliary. And they had various flotillas of them, and their assignments were various sounds along the coast, like the one that my father volunteered us for was St. Catherine's Island, which is down below Savannah. And what you had to do is go down, and the flotilla took care of it. You went down for one night and then came back, and then another one to come down and relieve you. So there were about 8 or 10 boats in each flotilla. And so you'd go down and do your patrol and check anyone coming in and so on. It was, I suppose, worthwhile. But well, actually, we were down there one time when there was a lot of commotion, and we were under complete strict orders not to get involved in anything like combat operation. That if any enemy showed up, we were supposed to disappear and let the regular Navy and Army take care of it. And something happened one time when we were down there. We didn't find out what it was for a while. But one of the darn fool German submarines landed a crew on St. Catherine's. And we had seen indications of it and had reported it back. And there was a radio communication between the island and shore. And they sent a contingent over and they captured them. And we were not involved in it, but they captured them. And, several months later, we found out these folks had been captured while we were down there.
How did you end up in Atlanta? After law school, did you take a job here? Or?
No, after law school, I practiced law for about 10 years. And then my father had an investment banking firm, a stockbrokerage firm, and it had gotten to the size that they needed a lawyer in-house. And I had been educated to go into the business anyhow. And so they asked me if I'd come aboard, so I did. And then after a couple of years, it was obvious that Atlanta was going to be a lot bigger than Savannah. And so somebody had to be transferred up to Atlanta with the name Johnson, and that was me.
What was the name of the firm?
Johnson Lane Space.
Anything else that you want to add? Mr. Johnson, thank you so much. It was a wonderful story.
Well,
I appreciate your taking the time to do this.
You're most welcome. I am in thorough sympathy with it. so far as providing information and everything's concerned.
Thank you very